What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and welcome to part 1 of 2 for Under the Radar this week. Yeah, we are going through pretty much everything that came out that I was interested in, that came out on June 24th, and yeah, not only did we have Porcupine Tree and Ailstorm, we had a lot more, about too many to fit into one episode, so I decided, you know what, we're going to split this week in half. We're going to do half of the albums for today here on Tuesday, and then the other half on Thursday, so that way I can give more in-depth thoughts, so to speak, on all these albums and give them all a moment of shine. And we're going to kickstart part 1 with Intoxicated's Watch Me Burn. So yeah, this is an album. They're actually the second album from this death thrash band, I guess you call it. They started out thrashed and they became more death thrash. And never heard of this band until I was going through Metal Archive, seeing what was coming up. And I was looking through like my interests, and I saw that this band was like thrash metal early, death thrash now. And that was an interesting way to get me ensnared. But then as I listened to this album, and I have to say, when it comes down to balancing, there is a great balance on here between like the thrashy energy and some of the death metal brutality. There's even a good amount of groove on this album, like a little bit akin to groove metal and like early metalcore. There's a little bit of those kind of grooves and breakdowns. But for the most part, this is straight up death thrash. Like, you got thrashy speed, thrashy riffs, but you also got some really cool like death metal chugs and percussion in there too. And it's also very short album, like it's only about 30 minutes and some change. Every song is short, sweet, to the point. Like, I think the shortest track on here was about 2 minutes, 45 seconds. Whereas average, it's about like 3 minutes and some change. So every song, it's just packed with a punch, packed with a lot of bite, and a lot of passion and energy. Really, the only thing I could really find that I didn't care for too much on this album, the vocal performance for me was a little bit inconsistent. Like, sometimes he would go into like a more hardcore scream. Sometimes he'll actually get into like a little bit of death metal territory, and sometimes he gets a little bit raspy, trying to sound a little bit like black metal, but it didn't all work for me. But aside from that, musically speaking, this is some heavy, brutal stuff going on right here. I give this album an 8.5 out of 10. This is a really good album. For my first time checking out Intoxicated, I was pretty impressed at how energetic this was, how brutal it was, and just how they were able to balance stuff out. Like, they were able to balance thrash speed with death metal brutality and some nice like hardcore groove metal grooves. So yeah, I would suggest checking this one out if you are fans of death thrash that has a little bit of groove involved. 8.5 out of 10. So now on to the second album of part 1, and that is the latest offering from Perdition Temple and their album Merciless, Upheaval. Another band that I've never heard of prior to listening to this album. And Perdition Temple, this is their 4th studio album, and they're on Hell's Headbanger Records, which is a hell of a label and a hell of a shop to get some good stuff from. And they're described as black/death metal, or blackened death metal, whatever you want to call them. I have to say, not only is there that, but there's quite a bit of thrash going on here. So it's like blackened death thrash. I think it's more appropriate for this band because... And this album is interesting because it's definitely the proper definition of a tale of two halves. First half is all originals, second half all cover songs. And the original tracks, all 4 of the original tracks, just fucking slay everything in its path. Like, there are these really dissonant riffs that are going on that definitely harken back to bands like Morbid Angel. In fact, I talked about this at length a little bit when I talked about the Nocturnal Graves album way back in January. To me, Perdition Temple is kind of in a similar vein as Nocturnal Graves, like blackened death thrash that's very much Morbid Angel worship in there, and that's definitely what I got with all 4 of those original tracks. There's a ton of Morbid Angel worship. It gets very thrashy, it gets very much downright evil with the Blackened atmosphere on top of this like death thrash aggression that's being presented. And then the cover songs, they covered an Infernal Majesty track, which was pretty cool. They covered Shub Nagroth, which is like, kind of like a Mexican Morbid Angel kind of band. So they did that track justice. And they actually covered a Morbid Angel song, Blood on My Hands, from Covenant, and they did an excellent job on that song to kind of take what the original was, but put their own spin on it with that more Blackened style attached. And then they covered Parasite from Pestilence from their first album, Malleus Maleficarum, and I definitely liked how Perdition Temple took that song and made it sound evil, whereas if you listen to the original version by Pestilence, it's much more energetic and more like pulse-pounding. Perdition Temple take that song and turn it into something very evil and sinister. And that's pretty much what they did with all 4 of those covers. They took what the originals did, but put their own spin on it, just like any good cover should be. Of course, the 4 original tracks kicked ass. I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10. I think I'm probably going to pick this one up because, wow. I mean, despite it being like only 4 original tracks and 4 cover songs, all the tracks were great on here, whether they were covers or originals. I had a good time listening to this. I actually might say this is better than the Nocturnal Graves album, at least for my opinion, as far as like doing that like Morbid Angel worshipping Blackened death thrash sound. I'm definitely probably going to pick this one up at some point this year. So yeah, 9 out of 10 for Perdition Temple. Now on to the third album for part 1 of Under the Radar this week, and that is the new album from Sayor Origins. So yeah, another band I've never listened to prior to recording this episode, and they are described as atmospheric blackened folk metal, and it's a one-man band, Andy Marshall, and this is in Scotland, and didn't have that much expectations going into this because, like I said, when it comes to black metal, I am very, very picky about black metal. Luckily with this album, there's much more to this album than just having a lot of black metal aesthetic. This album, yeah, it's atmospheric, it's very folky, there's some black metal in there, but it almost feels like an all-encompassing metal album to some degree because there are elements of classic metal, especially in the opening track. There is this like really cool Iron Maiden gallop. It gets a little bit death metal at times with some of the moments where it gets a little bit more aggressive. Even a little bit of thrash with some of the faster riffs that you get. Power metal for some of the epic dynamic shifts that you get. But yeah, this album, as far as everything all together, like this is about 41 plus minutes of just not really a whole lot of vocals and lyrics on this album. Like anytime vocals come in, it's for like a brief passage. And they are delivered wonderfully well, like whether it was the black metal shriek or some cleans, even some like choir vocals or duets, what have you. Like the vocal moments, they're very minimal on here, but they stand out. Really, this is mostly all about the atmosphere, the instrumentation, of how Andy's able to play all these different instruments, guitars, bass, drums. There's even like, violin and bagpipes, among so many other things. Heck, I think in Hurdy-Gurdy might have been on here too. Just really kind of embracing that folky vibe, but with a lot of beautiful atmosphere. Like, when it gets heavy, this album gets very heavy, but for the most part, there's a lot of great melodies on here, whether it's in like the traditional metal sense or black metal melodies. Like you do get some really cool melodic tremolo riffs that I actually kind of associate with bands like Dissection and Necrophobic and those kind of bands within like blackened death metal, mellow black death, whatever you want to call it. But the thing that I really latched onto the most with this album is just how beautiful everything was. Like, it's almost like sometimes the beauty is more in like a sorrow aspect. Other times the beauty's more in like an uplifting aspect. And I think you get more uplifting moments than you get the more downtrodden moments. And for me, this album, like I said, it's beautiful. There's heaviness to it. There's just a lot of different elements going on. I'm giving this one a 10 out of 10. Holy crap, I was blown away as to how beautiful this album was. Definitely going to pick this one up very soon, because this is just masterfully crafted, beautiful, atmospheric metal music. Tons of folk. Like I said, there's some of those black metal moments, some classic metal, some power metal, little hints of death metal. Just kind of an all-encompassing album for me. Like, this album kind of represents pretty much almost everything I love about metal, and I absolutely love it. I recommend you guys check it out right now. And now on to the fourth and final album for part 1 of Under the Radar this week, and that is the second album from Guillotine AD with Born to Fall. So yeah, Guillotine AD, this is their second album, formerly known as Guillotine before adding the AD part to it for reasons I'm not entirely sure. But going through this, and prior to listening to this album, I saw they were described as death metal, and they're from Atlanta, so they're from the Atlanta scene. And the more I was listening in throughout this album, the more I think it's like they sound much more than just death metal. Like, there's a lot of black metal being thrown in, a lot of sludge metal, like, and other people I saw this band getting noted as like mixing Florida death metal, Scandinavian black metal, and New Orleans sludge metal kind of into one big melting pot. And honestly, that's really what you get musically on here. It's like there are a lot of great death metal chugging riffs and some cool rhythms, some great black metal tremolos, and some sludgy, slower moments, and even sludgy breakdowns. You really get that throughout this entire album. Vocally, it's kind of all over the map. Like, it's like the range in the vocals is more in that, like, in-between death metal and black metal range. Kind of like a little bit of like a mixture of Dan from Nunslaughter and Anders from Necrophobic kind of combined together. Sometimes his voice will go lower, other times he'll get to that like raspy black metal scream. And like I said, musically it's just all over the place, and even a couple of longer tracks show up on here too that really kind of showcase what this band has in their toolbox with all these elements that I've been saying throughout this part of the video. And for me, they did it fairly well. There were moments on this album where I wasn't immediately sold on it, like some of the subsections where they kind of dragged a little bit, but it wasn't really a big deal for me. Overall, this was another really solid album this week. I give this one an 8.5 out of 10. This is definitely very evil and very aggressive, for damn sure, for a band that's listed as being just death metal, even though, like I said, I think they're much more than just death metal straight down the line. Like blackened, sludgy death metal, I guess, if that's a new subgenre that's going to be getting thrown all over the place. Hell, I could even compare this band to even bands like Goatwhore to some extent. So, but yeah, 8.5 out of 10 for Guillotine AD's Born to Fall. And that does it for part 1 of Under the Radar for the week of June 24th. Part 2 will be out on Thursday, where we got 3 more albums to talk about. But what did you guys think of these albums I mentioned? Let me know in the comments section below your thoughts. And until next time, horns high. See you guys Thursday. Their debut album, Obsessed by Cruelty, on Steamhammer SPV Records. Now, the interesting thing about this album is that there are 2 sessions of this album that was recorded during this time. The original session, which was actually released through Metal Blade Records in standard tuning, the label thought, this does not sound very good, you need to try again. And so they switched studios and producers and did a re-recording of the album and added an additional song, After the Deluge, featuring Uwe Christophers, who was known by the name of Asator, And yeah, 2 versions, one in standard tuning and one in D